We have as our guests Doctors Vince and Joe Vitale with the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, and it is a privilege for us to have you here. Welcome to Cincinnati.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be with you all. Thanks for having us.
This is a series of conversations that the Lord has opened up for us to have with those leading His church in different parts of the world. And tonight the format will just be a conversation, and we will ask the Lord to guide the conversation as we go. But as we get started, let's try to make you a little bit more human. And so we're going to ask you, tell us a little bit about the home and place where you grew up. Joe?
Great. I might need that because I have this little antennae from the speaker here, so I don't want you to think I'm an alien. Though actually I am now a resident alien. Now I'm living in America. Okay. So Vince and I moved to Atlanta about 1.5 years ago, but I'm from the UK. I grew up in London, and my dad was actually a pastor, so this is very comfortable for me. I'm enjoying your lovely stained glass as well. Lots of churches in England have stained glass, so I feel right at home. But my dad was a pastor, my mum was a GP, and London was kind of a fun place to grow up in. It's a pretty secular culture, and I was always sort of the only Christian or one of two in my year at school, so it was an interesting place to grow up, but a great place to grow up. Yeah.
We come from different backgrounds. I come from a non-Christian background and a loud, very colorful Italian-American family in New Jersey. And so when our families got together when we first met, if you've seen the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, just substitute Italian and you'll have some sense. Yeah. Joe was talking
Big for the first time, and yeah, he is called Great Uncle Big, and I've been talking for about half an hour, and finally he just shut me down and said, "Doll, everything you say sounds so beautiful, but I can't understand a word of it."
Yeah, and actually when I proposed to Joe, she actually said no, but I couldn't understand her accent. I thought she said yes, and she was too British and polite to correct me, and so
you just went forward at that point.
Keep calm and carry on.
That's it.
So tell us, how did the two families, how do they interact to this day?
You know, it's been great. Your family, they're really good sports, and I actually really enjoy my family despite the differences. It's something we've come to really enjoy. Mm-hmm. I feel like having lived in England for 10 years now, I sort of have a British pair of glasses, and I can kind of see my New Jersey family and sort of culture through a British lens. And I think Joe, similarly, now living in America, can sort of see her British family through an American lens. So that mixing of cultures. We lived in Oxford, England. It's a very international place. We attended a church there, which is very international. So we've really enjoyed that mixing of cultures.
How did you first meet each other?
So we were both students at Oxford. Vince was doing his PhD, and I was an undergraduate at the time. And we both went to the same church, but also we were based at the same college in Oxford. And actually, I think we first met at a theology dinner, which was kind of funny because, I mean, these are amazing events if you're evangelistically minded, because it's a room full of people studying theology who actually aren't Christians. And Vince and I were seated next to each other at dessert, but I think we very quickly worked out we were both already Christians going to the same church, at which point we just ignored each other for the rest of the evening because we both had our eyes set on different people we were trying to talk about Jesus with. So in hindsight, we were actually a really good match, but we had about zero interest in each other that evening.
That's a promising start.
Yeah. I mean, there's like a good reason that we didn't pay each other any attention, but there we are. And then we next saw each other actually at a small dinner. N.T. Wright was coming back to our college. He was at the same college that we were at for a dinner, and we were invited to be part of that dinner party. So I know you've had him here as well, but so we then reconnected at dinner with N.T. Wright and some others. And then a friend of ours who was on the pastoral team at St. Aldate's, our church in Oxford, noticed that we had a sort of conversational connection and would wind up talking after services, and she started inviting us over to dinner parties, and we would get there and we would be the only other two guests, her husband, and the two of us for this dinner party. So.
It's not that subtle.
Not that subtle.
No. But we're thankful.
Yeah.
How did you first hear God's call to be apologists for Christian faith?
So I I think when I was very young, I think from age 5, I was already telling everybody that I wanted to be a missionary. But in my mind, that meant go and live in a hut in Africa. And I really wanted to. I did go and live in Africa for a year when I was 18 to kind of test out the calling. I was based in Uganda, and that was an incredible year. And I absolutely loved living there. And I learned so much more than I learned way more than the blessing that I gave. But it was just a wonderful place to serve. But while I was there, I just sort of really sensed the Lord saying, you know, Joe, actually, people here, they don't have very much in terms of material wealth, but actually a lot of them knew the Lord better than people in my own cultural context. And I just sensed this prompting that the Lord was saying, actually, I'm calling you to be a missionary to your own culture, to your own people, to the places where people are very apathetic and they actually don't want to hear the gospel and they really don't care. And I was devastated because I had this dream in my mind. But anyway, so I came back to England and I was studying theology, and I didn't really know what apologetics was. I was very unfamiliar with the word. All I knew was that actually I just really wanted people to come to know Jesus. But in the culture we were in, it's just extremely secular, and you can't talk about Jesus without people asking you so many different questions and challenges. And so I sort of fell into apologetics as a tool in order just to really help remove the intellectual obstacles, to clear the way a bit so that people could see their way to Christ. So really, I wasn't someone who was crazy about apologetics for the sake of it, but it was more that I wanted people to come to know Jesus.
I guess for me, apologetics was part of my journey from the very beginning. When I arrived at college, if I'm honest, I thought Christianity was for people who didn't think hard enough. I was studying philosophy at the time, and I thought faith had to be a blind leap of faith. And thankfully, I was playing soccer at the time. There were 2 guys who were a year older than me on the team, and they challenged me to read the Bible, and they told me to start with the New Testament. They said, before you come to a firm conclusion about this, actually read the core book. And as I started to do that, what really struck me was that this wasn't a faith that was asking me to take some blind leap of faith or to leave my brain or my mind at the door. I saw the scriptures asking me to love God with my mind. I remember reading through the Gospels, being so impressed with the person of Jesus, seeing the incredible claims that Jesus made about who he was and saying, who is this guy? And then getting into the Acts of the Apostles. And if you read through the Acts of the Apostles with a sort of filter on for these types of words, it's just amazing. You read through and all sorts of words like reasoning and persuaded and explained and argued and debated and disputed and convinced and even proved. All of these words just scattered all through the Acts of the Apostles. It says the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians. Why? Because they examined the scriptures daily to determine if these things were so. It says that God had provided confirmation for everyone by raising Jesus from the dead. And then I started to look into the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and was completely blown away by the fact that you could even find evidence for this historical fact from 2,000 years ago, let alone how strong it was. So I needed this real change in my understanding of what faith was and what Christianity was asking of me in terms of faith, and apologetics was part of my story right from the beginning. Then after I gave my life to Christ, about 2 weeks later, I wound up on a missions trip down to Panama City Beach, Florida, with the Ministry of Campus Crusade, now Cru. And I didn't even know what a missions trip was at this point, but I just knew that these people who I started to get...
Not all of them are on the beach.
Not all of them on the beach. I thought, if this is what a missions trip is, you know, I'm going to go, spring break on the beach. But I was passionate about this newfound faith, and it turned out that a lot of what we were doing this week was going to be sharing that faith with people on the beach and in other places down in Florida. And I had a guy who was a couple years older than me, who wound up then being the guy who mentored me and discipled me for the next 5 years. Every Friday, a couple hours in the Bible, a couple hours playing racquetball or some other type of sport and just talking about life. So grateful, so very grateful to him for those early years. But he was the guy I was walking around the beach with, and I remember, I can still picture the faces of 2 people. We had lots of conversations that week, but 2 people who, when we shared about Jesus with them and what Jesus had done and what difference it makes, you could just see in their eyes that they started to get it. And I sort of fell in love with evangelism at that point. I just couldn't believe that God wanted to use me for something as significant and beautiful to share him with others. And that's been a big part of my life ever since.
That's great. I want to probe a little bit deeper into something that you mentioned, Joe, about trying to share Christ in a cultural context where there's both apathy, but also maybe right behind that apathy, lots of questions about Christianity or ways of maybe staying at a distance from Jesus. So talk to us a little bit more about engaging people and reaching into an apathetic setting.
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I do find encouraging is that people always care about something. It's just figuring out what that thing is. And I think the struggle when you first get to college and you're trying to tell people about Jesus and they're so uninterested and you think, Lord, I have nothing to say, what am I going to do? But actually, I think it's because I'd grown up with a model, and we'll often talk about this, of where basically evangelism is you have to share the gospel through these sort of 3 or 4 points, and you know your testimony is the sort of the beginning, middle, and end, the before Christ, met Christ, then after. And if people aren't interested in hearing the way you've learned to share, you sort of panic because you don't know what to do. Whereas actually learning, really, if I want to engage people, I have to learn how to ask questions. And that actually, we don't just have one testimony, but we have so many testimonies of what the Lord has done in our lives in different ways that he's helped us through different things. So really, the more you ask people questions and get to know their stories and find out where their burdens are, where their struggles are, what they're wrestling with, usually you have some kind of testimony that meets with where their struggle is. So say they're dealing with stress. As an undergraduate, lots of people are dealing with stress in their work. So being able to say, hey, you know, I used to struggle with that too, but this is how my Christian faith helped me, or this is how the Lord helped me through this process, and actually meeting people. So it's sort of looking at where their story is, where yours isn't, where they intersect, and bringing Christ into that intersection. So that was one way, and something I'm so encouraged about in the culture today actually is, particularly when you look at university college campuses across America, people these days are very, very passionate about a lot of things, a lot of social justice issues, and sometimes we can feel overwhelmed and intimidated by that passion. But actually, that is such a way in, because of course, the value that they're so concerned with, that human beings have dignity and rights, and we know exactly who gives that dignity and those rights. So we have a way to meet people where they're at. So I would just say, if you're feeling like people aren't biting when you're trying to fish, then just learn to ask good questions that get below the surface, questions that get to the heart of where they are. And sometimes if you get into that conversation where you do find yourself going round and round and sort of discussing a lot of questions and challenges about Christianity, but you know it's become very intellectual, and it feels like we're not getting to the heart of this. We're not getting to Christ. We're running around in philosophy or in problems with the Old Testament, but we're not actually getting to the heart of the issue. One question that Vince and I like to ask is, let me just pause the conversation for a minute, and let me just ask you, if this was true, would you want it to be? And if God was real, would you actually want to know him? Because we just found, when you ask that question, usually there's an awkward silence for about 10 seconds or so, but then it just shifts the direction of the conversation, and it moves it away from the sort of intellectual into the real motives of the heart, because it forces people to confront, am I genuinely seeking here, or am I just throwing up excuses so that I don't actually have to engage with the fact that I don't really want to know God, and maybe this is as much a heart issue as a head issue?
I think you hit it right on the nose. For us, just being good question askers is really the lion's share of being effective in evangelism. And as a society, and I don't tend to see a lot of difference inside and outside of the church here, we tend not to be very good at questions. You know, our common questions are things like, how are you doing? Fine. What's up? Nothing. How was the weekend? Good. And if we can ask more... It's hard to build a bridge. It's hard to build a bridge. And if you can ask more interesting questions, another question we love is, have you ever had an experience that has made you think there might be a God? And if you ask that question of enough people and just don't save them, then just give a little bit of room for them to actually reflect on the question, people will tell you the most amazing stories of things that they have experienced in their life. And you're sitting there thinking, wow, that has happened to you? And you don't think that there's a God? Let's talk about that. So we try to be good question askers, and then we try to be good responders to questions as well. Again, our responses to questions tend to be fine, all right, not bad, no problem. But a question like, how was your weekend? And today's Sunday, right? So how many people tomorrow are going to ask the question of you, how was your weekend? And if you're a church-going Christian at a solid, healthy church? That question is an absolute gift. And someone says tomorrow, how was your weekend? And we could just say, fine, thanks, how was yours? And I do that all the time. Or I could say, actually, it was really good. Saturday we were just doing things around the house, but Sunday we went to church. That's always a highlight for us. Do you ever go to church? No, never. No, I never used to go to church either. A friend invited us about 5 years ago. We started going. We've actually found it to be an incredible community for our family. We really love it. We'd love for you to join us sometime. Would you be open to that? That's not that weird. And actually, that's just a more honest answer to the question. If I've encountered the living God in the context of a biblical, healthy church service on a Sunday, then to answer the question, how was your weekend, with not bad, thanks, on a Monday, it's not even an honest answer. So that's, for us, engaging in a secular culture where sometimes there's that apathy. A lot of it is just about being good question askers and then giving real answers to the questions that we receive.
That's great. That's great. Let's go on the church direction there for a minute. So you qualified what you were saying there, a biblical, healthy church. So would that all churches were that way, but not all of them are, as you well know. When you think about today, both here in the U.S., but also with your travels internationally, what's the greatest threat that you see for the church today?
Maybe I'll start. Many different ways to answer that question, specific threats and larger threats. But, one that's very relevant to what we do is the way that the church will or will not deal with the questions of non-Christians, but even of Christians within the congregation. We have one friend named Nicole, and when she was younger, she asked her church-going mother, did Jesus really rise from the dead? And her mom said, Nicole, don't be difficult. And that was probably the last real question that she asked about Christianity. And today she's one of the most intellectually accomplished atheists that we know. So I think one of the biggest threats for the church is for us to not receive questions well, and not to welcome questions, and not actually to encourage questions. I think we need to be a place as a church where questions are seen not as a sign of a lack of faith, but actually as a form of worship. And there's two reasons why I get really excited about questions. One, because the answer to any legitimate question is something true, right? The answer to any legitimate question is something true. And as a Christian, I believe that all truth is grounded in God. So whatever someone's question is, if I'm thinking prayerfully enough and creatively enough, there's a connection between their question and the answer to that question, which is something true, which must therefore be in some way grounded in who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. So questions are an open door to share through. That's one reason to get excited about questions. And the other reason, I think, is because good questions is just how you get to know someone. Anyone. If I want to get to know Joe, I ask good, thoughtful questions about her. Even tough questions, even hard questions that deal with areas of her life that I don't find so easy. And the same is true with God. If God is personal, that's how we get to know him, by asking good, thoughtful, sometimes even hard questions. So I think one of the biggest dangers for the church is that we make especially the younger generations feel like they're doubters in some bad sense, or that it shows a lack of faith in them because they have questions. And I find that some of the healthiest churches that I find are ones that really welcome the questions, say we want the questions, we're not afraid of the questions. It's a gift to us if you give us our questions, and then respond in a biblical way.
I think especially encouraging young people, well, really anyone in the congregation, to have the courage to ask their hard questions of God and of the Bible as well. I have so many friends, and I get so many emails from people saying, oh, I've been reading this bit of the Old Testament and it's really shaking my faith. And part of me is thinking, hang on, you're 30, you've been in church your whole life. How are you only just reading this part of the Old Testament now? But also that people, I think, are often in the culture today, they're less biblically literate and therefore really intimidated by some of the more challenging passages that we find in Scripture. And I sometimes find that maybe even churches are shying away from actually grappling with the difficult texts and the challenges. And so they're not hearing it inside the church. And then they're hearing it from outside the church with people saying, well, what about this in the Old Testament? What about slavery? What about misogyny? What about racism? All these questions. And you don't know how to answer it. And so I think what happens is people then get scared to look into those difficult texts in Scripture because they sort of think, maybe it's too good to be true. Maybe I'm going to peel back the curtain and find that God isn't really who I thought he was. Whereas I find if people are encouraged to read the Bible together in the context of community, to have a space where you can ask your challenging questions about the Bible and grapple with it together as the church, then actually I find the very questions that years ago, and sometimes I'll come across something new and it'll challenge me afresh, but the things that you find frightening, if you actually dig into it together in the context of church community and you say, God, I want to know who you are, even the things that are hard to understand about you, I want to love you with my mind. If we do that as a community together, then really you come away thinking, wow, God, you're not worse than I thought. You are so much better. You're so much more beautiful and holy and glorious. And so I think just encouraging biblical literacy, especially with the sort of challenging apologetic questions around the Bible, because really the Bible is under serious attack in our culture today. I think it used to be the case people would look to the Bible for morality, but now we live in a culture that really blames the Bible for immorality, I would say. So I think as Christians, we need to be equipping our churches and our congregations before the rest of the world tells us what they think our Scripture says.
Yeah, and we've experienced this in our own life. I think we would say that a little Bible study often leads to challenges to your faith, but actually a lot of Bible study leads you to a place of great confidence and deepening of your faith. So if you are in that place where you go, oh, I've done a bit of Bible study and actually it's making me feel more vulnerable or challenged, push through that just as you would in the early stages of any relationship. And when you get through that little Bible study, it's that place where it's really a consistent part of your daily life. I think that's really when the deepening and the confidence in faith comes.
I find a lot of people lack confidence in their ability to answer the questions. So I was going to ask if you could maybe just provide us with your cell phones. And
Definitely.
So when we get a really hard question, if we could just pull that. But actually, as people hear those questions, give us encouragement. How do you? Is it okay to tell a non-Christian, that's a good question, I've wrestled with it, I'm still learning about that, or pathways that we can feel empowered even if we don't have full confidence. So how do you because part of your work is through you're on a journey of that. So tell us about how to feel confident in that intermediate state, if you will.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I don't know is such a good answer. And it's an answer that we give all the time. I actually think that you don't get to a place of really feeling confident in evangelism or apologetics until you get comfortable saying, I don't know. And it's a good place to be because it's a humble place to be. And it means it's not all about you. It's not that you're an answer man or an answer woman, but it's just that you want to point someone to Jesus. And so we say, I don't know all the time. And in fact, sometimes it's better. Sometimes if someone asks me a question, I don't know the answer. I say, I don't know. But then I always say, but I'd love to look into that for you. Do you have an email address I can contact you on? Or maybe it's a friend who I know. And then I'll go away and I'll do exactly what you said, Pastor. I'll phone a friend. Maybe that's an online resource, or maybe that's a book that I'll consult, or maybe that's someone in our team who does have the expertise that I don't have. Then a week later, to get back in touch with that person and say, hey, can we have a coffee together to discuss your question? I've done some looking into it for you and I'd love to talk more. It's actually a better result than if I had the answer in the first place. Now this person is impacted not only by the answer, but by the fact that I cared enough to invest in them through the week. And now they know that this meeting is coming up next Tuesday where we're going to talk about their question. And so they're actually thinking in their own time about God and about this question and how it relates to their life. And they've actually done a lot more preparatory work before we ever get together. So sometimes I don't know is an even better answer than just knowing the answer off the top of your head.
I think another thing to say is rather than being quick to answer questions, even if you think you do have something to say, actually always ask more questions before you say anything at all. It was Francis Schaeffer, who was a really great apologist, who said, if I have an hour with somebody, I will spend 55 minutes just asking them questions, and then 5 minutes at the end giving a response. And that's way more effective than if I spoke at them for 55 minutes and then only listened for 5. And the reason for that is because people may ask you a question for all sorts of reasons. And if you don't understand the reasons behind why they're asking the question, your response may be the wrong one. So, for example, if someone comes to you with a question about suffering, and they say, well, if God exists, like, why is there all these earthquakes going on? And you could immediately start giving some sort of responses, but actually it may well be that they framed it in that sort of intellectual way, but really it's just a smokescreen for the fact that their mum is dying of cancer. Right. And if you answer it one way in an intellectual way, you're going to completely miss the fact that this is a deep heart issue. And if you then find out, wow, their mum is dying of cancer right now, it's not really going to be appropriate to try and give an intellectual response at all in that moment. Really, you just want to get around them and hold them while they cry and cry with them and ask if you can pray for them. So just really don't be afraid to ask more questions. That's not copping out of the question. That's just trying to love somebody well, because the better you know why they're asking, the more fitting your response will be when you finally give it.
Yeah. There's a recent book, I can't remember exactly the numbers, but it's something like Jesus asked 307 questions in the New Testament. He was asked 150 something, and the ones that he just directly answered, just straight away, here's a direct, clear answer, is about 3. So if you look at the way that Jesus deals with conversation, he's asking a lot. He makes you feel better, right? He's asking a lot of questions, he's receiving a lot of questions, but when he does receive the question, he wants to know what's behind it, and he's not just diving right in with a quick, easy answer.
Tell us, on the other side of that, you have the chance to see maybe more of the body of Christ than some of us. So what are things that you see that give you hope for the church today?
That's a tough one for us to answer, because we're part of a team of 230 employees, 80 evangelists around the world. And we have this incredible privilege of getting updates from them all the time. So it's hard to pick something to hone in on, because our team sees people come to faith every week. And we get to rejoice about that every week in all parts of the world. The Middle East is an area which is incredibly encouraging at the moment. Some studies suggest that Iran could be the second fastest growing Christian community in the world, second only to China. That was unthinkable 10, 15 years ago. Just amazing to see what God is doing.
And even closer to home in this country, one of the great joys is we get to visit churches like this all over the country, and then you're just so encouraged by seeing what local Christians are just doing, where they're serving faithfully in their communities. And one example would be that we recently did a mission at UC Berkeley, and when we say that, everyone says, you went to UC Berkeley and there wasn't riots and you didn't get thrown out? And we thought we might, because we were there a month after some of the serious riots had been going on. But really, we got a hearing because of the Christians who've been serving faithfully on that campus, week in and week out for years, and just building up relationships, building respect with the university, so much so that actually they were helping pay for some of our evangelistic events, which was great. But we were there on International Women's Day, and as you can imagine, at a place like UC Berkeley, there was a lot of anger on the campus that day, a lot of protests and marching, and I'll be honest with you, when I sort of looked around at the scene of these really angry women, your initial instinct, I think, sometimes for us is we see that kind of hostility and we sort of want to become defensive or shrink away or shrink back from it. But actually, I was so proud of just watching this team of all these local Christians who were partnering with, just going out, just speaking with these women, just listening to their stories, just loving them. And of course, underneath all of the anger that was being expressed was just so much hurt and so much pain. And it made me think of when Jesus saw the crowd, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And really, that was how it felt that day. But just seeing Christians loving with so much compassion. Actually, there was a girl who was standing in the middle of the square that day with all the protests going on, and So she was wearing fishnet tights and a short skirt, and she was topless, and she just had a paper bag over her head. And a lot of people, you could tell they didn't know how to react to this girl, and a lot of them would just kind of hurry on by and turn away, and others would sort of laugh, because, I guess out of shock at seeing her. But if you got close enough, you could see written across the paper bag with the words, "All 5 of my rapists are getting away with it." And then you just looked into her eyes, and they were just so haunted. But seeing the girl that day, one of my colleagues just had the overwhelming sense of the Holy Spirit saying to her, out of everybody here on this campus today, I identify with her. I'm here for her. And so my friend Madeline just went straight up to this girl, and she just began to speak, just tell her how sorry she was, and speak some truth about the fact that she was loved by God, that she was made in his image, that she had value and dignity before him, that nothing could take away her worth from her, and that even though human justice had failed her, that divine justice wouldn't, because there was a God who was committed to justice. And then she shared about Jesus, and a Jesus who would come down and suffer alongside and be defaced and dehumanized and know what it's like to wear nothing but shame and be someone from whom men hide their faces. And, and as she was speaking, the girl just began to weep and weep and weep. And then she threw her arms around Madeline, and they just stood there holding each other in the middle of the square while everyone else was just walking by, kind of looking and thinking, like, what is going on? And then Madeline asked if she could pray for her, and the girl said yes, and they just stood there holding hands in the middle of that square, praying together. And that was just one example of what Christians are doing around the world, even in the places where you may think it's so hostile, the gospel could never get into Berkeley, it's too dark, it's too challenging, but the Holy Spirit is at work there, and Jesus is wanting to reach out, and it's a privilege to partner with other Christians who are faithfully witnessing in those places.
One of the Christian students there, I just remember her line in our morning prayer meeting. She said, "It is just so incredibly encouraging to see that salvation is possible and that it is near." And that's what we find as we travel around to many different places. If you love people well, if you take their questions seriously, and if you actually extend the invitation for them to know Jesus, salvation is possible and it's near.
Amen. Amen. When you think about the courage to, those stories are Christians living faithfully outside the walls of the church. And as you think of reaching, answering questions, meeting in public spaces, speak for a minute to church leaders. I'm a pastor. There are other pastors here. There are other churches represented, other leaders. What would be your counsel or encouragement to leaders, knowing that we bear responsibility to help Christians live like that? So.
I want to ask the question in the other direction, but that's generous of you to offer for us to speak into that. And I think I would start where I left off, that salvation is possible and it's near. And to develop in your own lives and in your community an invitational culture. I was we both were at a church recently. I was actually in Ohio. And I spoke in the morning, and then I spoke in the evening at sort of a special service on an apologetic topic. And there was a guy who was sitting over there on the right-hand side. And after the talk was over, I stepped down. 2 people came up to speak to me. One whose boyfriend had just committed suicide. The other one was dealing with gender dysphoria. They were both long conversations. And then by the time I was done with those 2 conversations, the whole room had emptied. But this one guy, who looked like quite a curmudgeon, he was still sitting on the far right side. And so I walked up to him. I said, "Thank you so much for waiting. Really patient of you. What can I help you with?" And he looked at me and he said, "I'm just trying to give my life to Christ." And he explained that he had come to this service Sunday morning. And at the end of my sermon, I had been invitational and kind of said to people what it might look like to take that step of giving your life to Christ. And he wanted to do that, but he came forward, but he couldn't find someone to do that with. Thankfully, there was this Sunday evening service until he came back, sat through that. This non-Christian guy, he sat through that whole hour-long talk. And then he sat there for another hour where I had 2 other conversations, and then I went up to him, and my thought was, and then we had this beautiful time together, and he just prayed this. He understood the gospel. We talked it through. He prayed this most beautiful prayer of a new believer. He referred to God as man during his prayer, which I just he was just his raw, just where he was, his language. But he wanted forgiveness. He understood who Jesus was. But the thing that I found so convicting was that this was the other thing he said. He said, to be honest, I'd rather do this with a normal person. And by that, I guess he meant somebody who wasn't in a kind of ministerial capacity. He said, but you're still here. And what I thought and what I shared with the church leadership later was I said, the thing is, he didn't even want to do that with me. If anyone in the building had just walked up to him and said, can I help you? The first words out of his mouth would have been, I just want to give my life to Christ. And so I think if we can develop communities where we're expecting on a Sunday morning and at other times throughout the week that God is going to work powerfully, that God has eternally significant things to do every time we get together, that we're going to be inviting friends and family and coworkers into this community, and that afterwards, Acts 17 says, Acts 27 says God's not far from anyone. Mm-hmm. And even as evangelists who do this full time, if you ask us to tell you who are the people who are close to accepting Jesus and who are the people who are far, we get it wrong 9 out of 10 times. Mm. You just never know. God is not far from anyone. And I think if you can develop communities where we're invitational, we're bringing non-Christians into our community, and then we're on the lookout and we're sensing God's Spirit moving, and we're just asking those questions. What did you think of that? Do you have any questions? Is there anything I can pray for you about? Just simple questions. If we're an invitational community, I think we'll see a lot of evangelism and effective evangelism taking place within the church as well.
Finn's got a reputation in our church in Oxford for being an evangelist, but it was really just because we'd sit near the back of church on Sunday services, and if we saw anyone leave early, he would just chase them out the back into the alley, and they probably felt a little intimidated initially, but just to find out, hey, why are you leaving? What did you think of the service? And so even things as simple as if you see someone go early, why not just pop out and say, hey, you okay? What did you think of the service? Or if you're not sure who's new and who isn't, look around and say, okay, who looks a bit uncomfortable? Who's maybe overdressed for our service this morning because they didn't know what to wear to church? Just little clues that will help you figure out, okay, who here is maybe struggling, is maybe new, just needs a conversation and a welcome. And the other thing is, I love the phrase that a friend of ours says all the time, love takes initiative. And so just looking into your communities and thinking, where are the places where people aren't being reached, or maybe they just have a real misconception of what Christianity is about? Maybe they've been burnt, maybe they've been hurt. I went to a church in Texas last year, in Austin, that it was right next to a very liberal college, and there'd been some bad blood between the church and the college, I think about 20 years previously. And so there weren't really any Christian ministries getting onto the campus, and they just didn't know how to connect with the university students. So the church just thought, okay, well, why don't we just throw open our doors every Monday and just have a free lunch for the students? And that'll be it. We won't preach at them. We won't do anything else. We'll just open our doors for lunch. And this had been going on by the time I got there for 3 years. And now they had 1,000 students every Monday coming for free lunch at the church. And they just showed hospitality year in and year out. And this was the first time after they'd finally earned trust, build up trust, they asked me to come in and with a couple of other members of our team and do some evangelistic talks. But they waited a long time to do that, just to build trust with the students. And because the trust had been built, then a lot of the members of that congregation who built friendships then had the opportunity that week to pray with some of those students to become Christians. But it was because they'd seen a need, they'd thought, okay, maybe we're not yet ready to go all the way with the gospel here, but we can make a start. So just look at the place and think, where would love take initiative in our local community?
I love that. I love that. Both of you are PhDs. You've done advanced study. Tell us in this part of your life about a big shift in perspective that happened for you that along the way that's informing and shaping your ministry today.
Well, I'll share something that's It's relevant to my approach to academic studies, but it's also just relevant to the way I have conversations with people and try to do everyday evangelism, everyday apologetics, everyday life with people. There was an example of this 3 weeks ago, when we were at Berkeley. And I was having a conversation with an atheist student named Luke, really smart guy. And it was one of these sort of what about this conversations where he was saying, what about, and then detail, the most challenging passage in the Old Testament. And then I would give him, my best answer to that. And he's, well, what about, and what about, and he would just be one after another, just firing off these. And I just felt like I was on the back foot and just sort of swatting away these objections. And I think years ago, I would have just kept answering those questions just over and over and over in that same style until one of us sort of passed out from exhaustion. And if it was him, then I'd try to baptize him then.
It's good, it's good. I like that kind of strategic thinking.
Yeah. But what I said to him, and this is something that really Ravi Zacharias has helped to mentor this into me, and is something that is sort of a positive apologetic that we try to take as a ministry. Yes, we answer the challenges that are being thrown at us, but we also have a positive case to make for the Christian faith. And so what I said to this student, after I had first taken seriously some of his questions, I had answered a couple of his questions, I then said, look, I wonder if maybe this isn't the best approach to our conversation. I said, when you were choosing which college to come to, when you were choosing to come to Berkeley, you didn't make that choice by showing up on campus for your visit and trying to find the potentially most problematic aspects of Berkeley as a university, and the things that potentially could have been least attractive to you about this university. I said, no, you showed up with 3 or 4 major questions in mind. And you said, for a university to do a good job and to give me the sort of education that I'm looking for, it would need to respond to these 3 or 4 questions well. That's how you made that decision. I said, and I think that's how you make any significant decision in life. So let's do the same with worldviews. Let's think about what 3 or 4 big questions does a worldview have to answer well in order to be something that we want to commit to, and that's going to help us to live a meaningful and coherent life. I said my colleague, Ravi Zacharias, he's delineated 4 questions: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. A worldview should answer those 4 questions. Where did we come from? Where are we headed? What's the purpose of life? And therefore, how should we live in light of that? I said, let's look at those positive questions, and let's put your atheism and my Christianity on the table in front of us and see how they do with respect to each of those 4 questions. So that was just sort of a change of perspective. And in my academic work as well, I think starting off, I always just wanted to know, what are the challenges being thrown at Christianity, and could I withstand them? Both in my personal conversations and in my academic study, it has moved more towards saying, actually, there's so much positively to say about the Christian faith and who Jesus is. Let's figure out what the questions are that we all need to answer, and then let's show how Jesus is unique in the way that he can answer those questions.
That's great.
I think for me, it was actually something we already touched on about what do you do when you fear not knowing the answers? Because you may look at people up on a stage who answer questions for a living and think, well, those guys must know everything or must always know what they're talking about, but it's just not true. And I was speaking earlier with Christine, and we were just talking about the fact that actually when you do a PhD, all it means is you know a lot about a tiny little thing, and all it really shows you is how much you don't know about everything else and how many more questions there are to ask. And but as we were really moving into these roles, I remember just really battling with fear, because I sort of thought, how can I get up on a stage and someone may ask me a question that I don't have an answer to, and this terrible, overwhelming weight of, what if I not only make myself look stupid, which is fine, but what if I make Christianity not look as appealing or as attractive, or what if I put people off Jesus because I get something wrong? And I was getting so fearful about whatever question may come that I couldn't predict. And I remember the climax of the fear was I was at a Q&A, and somebody asked me a question about the mauling of the lions in the Old Testament. And I'm sitting there thinking, I know about the bears, but where are the lions? And for the life of me, I couldn't remember where these lions were. And I remember before my next,
too.
Yeah, where are the lions? Well, I'm not going to tell you. You have to go look it up. But Anyway, so before my next speaking event, I woke up at about 4 a.m. in the middle of the night, and I sat up in the night, and Vince was there, and I literally exclaimed, "But what about the lions?"
That actually happened.
I couldn't go back to sleep until I'd figured out where these lions were and what on earth I would say about the lions. But it was just getting really crippling, this fear, and it was getting in the way of the joy of serving the Lord in this ministry. And so finally I took some time out just to really pray, and as I was praying and just on a bit of a retreat day, I God just kindly reminded me, you know, Joe, I didn't call you to be an apologist for the multiverse theory, as important as it is that I made the universe. And I didn't call you to be an apologist for Leviticus 18, although it is my inspired word. And I didn't call you to be an apologist for the doctrine of penal substitution, as crucial as that is to your salvation. Actually, I called you to be an apologist for Jesus Christ. Amen. And it was just that reminder of, I don't have to know every answer to every question. I just have to be able to introduce people to this person that I've met. And I may not be able to say everything about everything that comes up, but I do know Jesus, and I can talk about Jesus, and it is a privilege to get to introduce people to Jesus. And I think just reframing it, just remembering it's all about Christ, and everything else we can do is helpful. And if we don't know, that's okay. We say we don't know, and we move on, and that's all right. But just let people see Jesus. And so my prayer really in this last season has just been, Lord, help me not to spend all my time putting out fires, but instead I really want to start them. I want to be on the front foot in terms of presenting Jesus to people rather than just panicking about what I still don't know.
I love that. I love that. If you are on the tube and you're going through London and someone asks you, what is a Christian? And how would you answer?
I think the first thing that we would probably say is we would ask probably quite a number of questions, even on a short tube ride, before we just jumped in with the answer to that question.
What if you knew from their bag and address that they were going to be getting off at the next stop?
It's a great question. It's a great question. The first thing I would probably do would be say, I can't tell you how much I would love to have this conversation with you because Jesus has made the most incredible, transformative difference in my life. Can we please talk longer? I'm going to answer your question as well. But I would first try to get a contact off the person. If somebody has that sort of question, I think so often we assume that a taxi ride has to be just a taxi ride. I can't tell you how many times I've said to a taxi driver, are you on Facebook? Do you have an email? Sometimes people are a little more protective over a phone number, but literally in, what's it been now, 20 years of asking people if they'll carry on conversations like this, I've never once had someone not give me some form of contact information, whether that's a Facebook contact or another way of getting in touch. But I'd want to say to somebody who said, who is Jesus? Is that the question?
Or what is a Christian?
What is a Christian? That a Christian is a follower of Jesus. And if somebody says, well, what is a follower of Jesus? I said, well, it's following a person that loves you so much that they would give their life for you. Is that the sort of person that you would want to follow? Yes, that's the sort of person that I would want to follow. If that's the sort of person you'd want to be in deep relationship with. Yes, it is. Okay, well then we need to talk a little bit more about why that person would give their life for you. And then we can move that conversation on to questions about the sin in each of our life. Do you understand your need for forgiveness? Is that something that you have felt before, where you've done things wrong and you've had this sense that actually I need to be forgiven by someone? Someone may say yes, they may say no. That will carry on the conversation. Once someone understands their need for forgiveness and that there need to be consequences for what we've done wrong, then we can explain to someone why Jesus would come and die for them. And then they could be in a position to accept that sacrifice, to say yes to Jesus, to step into a relationship with him. And then, like I was saying earlier, to say, here's someone who has given his life for you, and then says there's no greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. As Jesus has given his life for us, what does it then look like for us to go out and serve others with that same sense of radical love, extravagant love, grace, unconditional love towards the other, even the people who are our enemies, even the people who we disagree with. So I want to start by saying there is a person who loves you, not because of what you've done or earned or merited or deserved, but who loves you just for who you are so extravagantly that they gave their life for you? Is that someone you would like to know? If it is, let's talk about why they gave their life for you. And then hopefully pretty quickly, we could be in a position for someone to say, yeah, I'm a person who's in need of forgiveness and who's in need of the sacrifice of Jesus and wants to step into a relationship with him.
Yeah. I mean, really, what Vince said, but I mean, a Christian is someone who has finally given up on trying to save themselves and allow God to save them. And I think I would say that's what's utterly distinct about Christianity from any other worldview or way of doing life, that in every other respect, it's about trying to prove yourself, earn your way, make the best of things. Whereas in Christianity, it's basically recognizing, I just cannot do this by myself. No matter how hard I try, I cannot be the person that I long to be or desire to be. But there is a God who knows that about me and has stepped down and has actually come to rescue me. It's not. If you think about other religions, often people talk about it as well. There are many paths at the mountain, but there's one way to God. But the view from the top is the same. I'll say, no matter if you get up there, it's all going to look the same once you've climbed up the mountain. But of course, as Christians, we would say, no one can even get up the mountain. We don't have it in ourselves from our own human effort. We're not smart enough. We're not good enough. We never will be. But the message of Christianity is God recognizing that and actually coming down the mountain to us, making that way for us so that we can have relationship with him. And I think because a lot of people in our culture say, well, there are many ways to know God. It's so arrogant to say there's only one. Why Jesus? Why do I need Jesus? But actually, when you really look at the different world religions out there, there's only one that even claims to take you to God, actually, if you really want to examine it. In Buddhism, it leads towards nirvana, which is nothingness. If you're going to look at Hinduism, there's no meaningful sense in which you're stepping into relationship with God, because the afterlife is basically dissolving into God and becoming part of this sort of collective whole. If you look at Islam, it's about paradise, which is about a lot of the earthly pleasures that we have experienced for eternity, and there are more of them. But the one person who's noticeably absent when the Quran talks about paradise is Allah. It's only in Christianity where we're offered a relationship with God. And when Jesus says this is eternal life, to know that the Father and Jesus Christ whom he has sent, that we're made for relationship. So Christianity is about having a relationship with the God who made you for himself and who's done everything necessary to bring you into relationship with him when you couldn't get there on your own effort.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and it's a great conversation to have even within the church and with Christians or with people who are churchgoers, not to assume too much about even the people who are sitting next to you in church. I mean, I grew up in a non-Christian background, but if you had asked me if I was a Christian, I probably would have said, well, yeah, I'm an Italian-American from New Jersey, therefore Catholic, therefore Christian. But if you had probed a little bit more deeply, I thought of God basically like Santa Claus. He was someone who was distant. He was somebody who was weighing my good deeds against my bad deeds, keeping a list. And if it, weighed more in the good direction, I was going to get some presents. And if it weighed more in the bad direction, I was going to get coal. Maybe he'd stop by once a year, but never stay long enough to say hello. I mean, that was my conception of the Christian God. And yet, if you asked me, I probably would have said, yeah, I'm a Christian. I'm an Italian-American from New Jersey. I'm a Catholic. Actually, my conception of God was a lot more like the Islamic conception of Allah than it was like the Christian God. So always ask those questions, even as you're sitting in church. I always just say, have you been at this church for a long time? I said, do you come from a religious background? People find that a not intrusive or offensive question. Did you come from a religious background, your family background? It's not saying, are you a Christian? It's kind of asking about someone's background and culture. And then very quickly from that, I get to hear someone's story and get to hear what they believe about God, and the conversation goes from there.
What do you think are false assumptions that non-Christians have about Christianity?
I'll let you start, because that's partly mine would be that God is distant and that God is someone. I just think the Christian gospel of grace, of a God who comes down and whose love is not based on what we earn or merit or deserve. It's just so countercultural. Everything in our culture fights against it. Everything in our culture tells us you only get what you deserve. You have to hike yourself up by your own bootstraps. Don't rely on anyone but yourself. It's just, Everything, every ad that we see, our eyes flash across something like 3,000 advertisements per day. And every one of them, or at least almost every one of them, is saying something like, just this one more thing. If you acquire just this one more thing, then you'll be good. Then you'll have gotten there. And you need to work your way towards that. I just think the gospel of grace is so countercultural within the church, outside of the church, that so many people who think about Christianity think it's about just living a good moral life and trying to live a better, more moral life. And the reality is that, Jesus didn't come just to make bad people good. He does want to make us better, but ultimately he came to make dead people alive, and that's a very different thing.
I think one thing I'm seeing a lot in the culture today is a sort of shift in perceptions of Christians. So I think even if you went back a decade, a couple of decades, the general perception of Christians would be, they're kind of naive and misled, but they're harmless, they're do-gooders, essentially. They're do-gooders, and let them get on with their thing because they're doing good things. Whereas now, I really think there's been a real reframing of the way that people see Christianity, particularly in the younger generation, particularly on university campuses, but also you'll see it in the media. And basically, the perception now is Christians are not do-gooders, they're do-badders. And no longer are our views believed to be sort of naive but harmless, but actually they're seen as harmful, and they're seen as hateful, or even hate speech. And so I think we're fighting a radically different perception even than was true when I first went to university, and it's come very quickly. And it's why one of the programs we run at the Zacharias Institute, where we're based in Atlanta, is for high schoolers about to head off to college, because you get to university college and a lot of them have even been homeschooled, and suddenly you're faced with this environment that just thinks you're terrible for being a Christian. And it's so overwhelming to have to deal with that on a college campus. And so trying to equip Christians for how do you begin to respond to that? How do you diffuse that hatred and so much misunderstanding about what it means to be a Christian, and what your political views must be, and what you must think about people, and how judgmental you must be. And so I think we're combating a lot of challenges there in terms of what does it look like? I mean, so often people have heard the message pro-life, but they've seen it as such a narrow thing, because of course as Christians we are pro the life of everybody, from womb to tomb, all the way through every kind of person. And I think for us it's learning how do we help people see the bigger and the better story that Christianity has to present, because actually when you get down to it, there's no other worldview that gives you such a foundation for human dignity, that values human people so much, that has to say, hey, you're not just a cosmic accident, you're not just a random collation of DNA, you're not just a dying mammal in a dying universe with no meaning, being asked to build your life on a firm foundation of unyielding despair, as Bertrand Russell would say, but actually you have value, you have purpose, you're not an accident, you're made, and that there's a dignity to you and to your life. And so far from Christians being people who look down on others, actually we elevate the person, and every single person has that kind of value and is loved by God and is made in his image. So that's the kind of perception, and that's the message we need to get across. But I do think we constantly have to think about how we're going to do that, because it is a current challenge.
Tell us a little bit more about how we're going to do that.
Well, here's one example that just came to mind. But we were ministering in a church, and a probably young 20s young woman came down after the service and explained that about 3 years ago she had come out as gay, and had therefore assumed that God no longer loved her, and had walked away from this church which she had grown up in, and hadn't been back to church since. And for some reason she just felt like she should go to church, and wound up back in church this evening. And when she came out as gay and told her human father that news, now he was a Christian, someone who took the Bible seriously, someone who didn't agree with the decision that his daughter had come to. And yet, when she told him, the first words out of his mouth were, "I have given my life to be your father." and nothing that you could do could ever change my love for you. Now, I think they had a lot of other conversations after that, but that was the starting point. And as this young woman was in the church service and listening to the sermon and the musical worship, she told me that line just kept going around and around in my head. I have given my life to be your father, and nothing you could ever do could change my love for you. And she's like, as that went around and around in my head, somehow I just knew that it wasn't just my human father's words, but that those were God's words to me as well. And I had actually in that sermon spoken about Hassan from Nigeria and some of the sacrifices that he is making for the sake of the gospel. And the combination of those words going around in her head, understanding God's love for her, and seeing that actually some of the deepest and most meaningful following of Jesus can come in response to sacrifice, she decided that day that she was going to live for God again and give her life to Christ. So leading with the love of God as God led for us. And also, I think the second part of that, going to Hassan's story, is not presenting the gospel and Christianity as if it's like a cherry on top of your already good life. You know, there is a reality that God is calling Hassan to significant sacrifice, but he's also calling me to significant sacrifice, and he's calling you to significant sacrifice in order to follow him well. That's going to look different in each of our lives. But if we preach and share a gospel that's devoid of sacrifice, then of course it's going to look weird when just certain segments of society need to make a significant sacrifice in order to follow Jesus. The reality biblically is that we all do, but it's worth it because of who he is and what he has done. I think as a society, we've sort of become scared of truth. Interesting, The Economist not too long ago said we live in a post-truth world. Oxford English Dictionary actually made that their word of the year in 2016. And I think it's partly because society's become afraid of truth, because we think that truth leads to disagreement. Okay, fair enough. But then that disagreement has to lead to the devaluing of the person you disagree with, and then to intolerance of that person, and then to extremism, and then to violence, and down the line to terrorism. And if that's the sort of trajectory of truth, then truth is like an act of war. And an act of war only leaves you with two options. Either you fight or you flee. Either you see truth as more important than love, and then you fight for truth no matter the consequences, even if that means you wind up becoming a person that's intolerant and extremist and violent. Or you see love as greater than truth. Then you flee from truth and you just accept every belief, no matter how incoherent, because at least that's better than winding up intolerant, extremist, and violent. Fight or flee, love or truth. I think that's sort of the cultural ultimatum that we're living in. And one of the things I love about Jesus is that he refused to choose. He refused to choose between that ultimatum. Why? Because he is both. God is love, and Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And so if God is love and God is truth, then love and truth are really, most fundamentally, one and the same. And that's what we see in the way Jesus communicated with us. His very coming was an act of disagreement with us, right? It was a statement that we required saving because our lives had disagreed so badly with what he intended for them. But his very coming was also his act of extravagant and radical love for us, that he would give his life for us. He found a way to communicate his disagreement to us that was one and the same as his act of radical and extravagant love for us. So it's perfect love and perfect truth, perfectly united in a personal sacrifice. This doesn't make this easy, but I think it's a framework we can work with. When we're dealing with people we disagree with, when we're dealing with our enemies, at least we know what question to ask. What does it look like for me to communicate truth and maybe disagreement to this person through an act of radical love and personal sacrifice? That's the question that Jesus figured out how to answer for us. And if we want to interact well with those we disagree with, then we need to figure out how to answer that same question in our interaction with them. So that's just one framework that I find helpful as I'm thinking through different difficult questions and different people who hold views that I disagree with. Not love them without truth, not express truth to them without love. Jesus found this creative way in the beauty of the cross to have both of them simultaneously as one and the same. And what does it look like for me to do the same?
Amen. 2 last questions.
Cool.
So tomorrow you're going to be speaking at the University of Cincinnati at a Veritas Forum. And can you give us just a sneak preview? The title is God on Trial. And Joe, you're going to be speaking about maybe misperceptions of the Bible and the God of the Bible from your Old Testament studies. Vince, you're going to be speaking on suffering and how we can understand. You've done a lot of work in that area. Can you give us a preview of the heart of what you're each going to be sharing tomorrow?
Sure. I'm excited to do this together with Joe. It's always good for a philosopher to have a biblical scholar standing next to him. In case I start to stray off with overly creative thoughts, she can pull me back.
A standard recommendation for me is finding a beautiful, godly Old Testament scholar and marrying them. So just
Fair enough. So we're looking forward to doing this together, and I'm going to come at it from more of the philosophical angle, which is my background, this question of why God would allow evil and suffering. Hopefully feel the force of the objection first, but then give a few different ways that Christians understand this, and then show the uniqueness of the Christian faith and having a God who is willing to come down and suffer with us, utterly unique to the Christian faith. I'll throw in some stories of the Vitale family as well. A ring that gets thrown off a bridge and sinks to the ocean floor. A punch that causes a bloody nose. I won't tell you too much more, but we'll get some of that loud, colorful Italian-American family will make its way into the talk as well.
They make their way into everything. They're even in my talk. So I'm going to be talking about really addressing that question of, is the God of the Old Testament a moral monster? But I'll be doing it through the framework of looking at 3 particular issues people often bring against the God of the Bible. Question about, is he genocidal? Looking at some of the warfare texts. And then what about slavery? And then the question of treatment of women, and is God sexist, basically. So that's what we're going to be looking at, and particularly framing it in light of some of those troubling texts that, you come to them and you immediately think, oh my goodness, what is this doing in the Bible? And then you spend some time unpacking it and you realize, oh wow, that's why it's there. And
right.
So that's what I'll be doing.
Last question, just to end on a note of global vision. Sometimes I ponder what it would be like to see what Jesus Christ accomplishes in a single day. Mm-hmm. And as a ministry leader, you see Christ at work in several hundred lives. You may hear from missionaries in a given day, and I'm moved on a daily basis at what I see the Lord doing. Can you just share, as we close our time tonight, a way that you personally have seen God at work in the world that maybe the rest of us haven't seen?
Sure. I was just resonating with what you were saying, Pastor, about wishing that we could see everything that God is doing. And once in a while you get a glimpse of that. And it's such a great reminder that God is always doing more than we see and not less than we see. And I just, a couple weeks ago, got an email from someone who had seen a show that I was on in England about a year ago. It's called BBC Big Questions. It's like the one quasi-religious program on the main BBC station on a Sunday morning. And it's a debate show, and they put 5 people on the one side and 5 on the other, and there's a question that you're debating. And I might go on for a question like, isn't faith irrational, or something like this. And there'll be 5 atheists on one side, and then on the other side, who are supposed to be like all of my like partners in this, of like someone from a Unitarian background and someone from a Hindu background and someone from an Islamic background, and then somebody from a very liberal tradition of Christianity, and then me. So I'm like, oh man, we're not even shooting at the same goal here, and everybody on the other side is arguing for the same conclusion, and it's one of these instances where you walk away. You have to just fight and claw your way to get a word in edgewise, and you walk away from this show going, oh, was it worth the stress? Did I say anything coherent or that could have at all been useful to anyone? And this was a year ago, and then 2 weeks ago, got a message from a young woman named Kelly who said, I saw that show, and I thought that you were saying some reasonable things, and so I started reading a couple of books, and that led to this, and this led to that, and I'm getting baptized on April 15th. And so it's just one of those examples where you don't always get to see everything, but God's always doing more, not less. And just one other guy who we saw come to faith recently. I think you'll be encouraged by this because only Jesus can do this. But he journeyed with us for a week on a college campus. Came in skeptical on a Monday. By Tuesday, had some questions. By Wednesday, was becoming involved in the community. By Thursday, some of those intellectual objections have been cleared away. Like Joe was saying, his heart was open to what was being communicated to him through the scriptures and in response to his questions. And then on Friday, he was in a place where he wanted to pray to start a relationship with Jesus. And he prayed this beautiful prayer. And then when he opened his eyes, these were his very first words as a new believer. His very first words were, I have always felt alone and like I had to wear a mask. But now this is the first time in my life that I can take off that mask and be fully myself and fully alive. No theory can do that. No worldview can do that. Only a living God, only the living God of Jesus Christ can do that. It's such a privilege to be able to see people have their lives transformed and literally become a new creation, speaking new words of life all around the world. What would you say, Joe?
I think the wonderful privilege of getting to do what we do is just that it really has nothing to do with us. And most of the time I just feel like I'm just a spectator to seeing what God and what the Holy Spirit is doing. And I remember, just in case you're someone who feels like God could never use me that way, because that was really where I started out. And I can remember one of the early missions we went on, it was in the UK, and I was praying, I was saying, Lord, I know you say that the harvest is plentiful, but to be honest, I'm having a really hard time believing that here in England, and no one is interested. No one wants to know. Please, would you help my unbelief? Because I had a lot of unbelief that evangelism could even work in that context. And I remember the week began, and it wouldn't stop raining all the time, and I was handing out flyers in the rain, and people would take the leaflet about the talk that was being advertised, and they would walk about 2 feet and then drop it. And so I went out with this pile of like soggy, wet flyers just down the road from me, and I was just thinking, this is the worst. Nothing good is ever going to come of this week. And but finally, lunchtime came round, and Vince was giving the talk, so I set off to try and find it, but I got lost because I didn't know the campus, and I'm standing there in the rain, wet and lost and miserable, and then I just hear a voice say, can I help you? And I turn around, and there was a girl standing there, and I said, yeah, this is where I'm trying to get to, and she said, oh, that's where I'm walking, why don't we walk together? And so we got chatting, and her name was Grace, and she was from China, and I said, where are you from in China? And she said, oh, I'm from a place no one's ever heard of in the middle. And I said, well, the only place I've ever been in the middle of China is Xi'an. And she said, oh, that's where I'm from. Mm-hmm. And so we had this great conversation, and I'm there thinking, oh, this is great. I should invite her to one of the talks. Before I can even get the words out of my mouth, she says, it's Chinese New Year tonight. Do you want to come to my house? And I'm thinking, my goodness, she's better at this than I am. But I couldn't go that evening. But I said, hey, we're having a jazz and dessert night tomorrow night. Why don't you come along? And I was feeling so wimpy and discouraged. I didn't even tell her it was a Christian event. I just said, do you want to come? And she said yes. And so she was coming. And then so the next night came along, and I prayed the most flippant prayer. I think because I was almost too scared to really pray very sincerely. I'm just praying, God, please let Grace become a Christian tonight. Amen. That was the extent of my
really
prayer.
Heartfelt.
Really heartfelt. Yeah, really heartfelt. But anyway, so Grace sits down, and the evangelistic talk is sprung on her, and I'm thinking, gosh, now I'm going to have to do some explaining. But afterwards, she just turns to me at the end of the talk, and I said, so hey, what did you think about that? And she said, well,
She said, I walked into a church for the first time to the university chaplaincy 4 months ago, and I picked up a copy of the New Testament in Chinese, and I've been reading it, and I don't really know any Christians, but I've watched them from afar, and the two things I noticed about Christians is they work harder than anybody else, and they're full of joy. And she said, and I've been reading about Jesus, and so we got talking. Obviously, I had no idea about any of this, but we got talking, and it just became really clear she really understood who Jesus was, and she really understood the gospel, to the point where I'm always trying to create problems and obstacles just so I can answer questions that she doesn't even have. And so I'm sitting there thinking, I should probably ask this girl if she wants to become a Christian, but I'm still trying to work up to get the faith to do it, when she just turns to me and she says, so what do I do if I want to become a Christian? And I said, now? And she said, yes, now. And so we just prayed together in this amazing prayer. And I remember her saying afterwards, I don't think it was an accident that when I wound up choosing my English name, I chose the name Grace. And I said, no, Grace, I don't think it was. But it was just one of those incredible moments where I was lost, I was dejected, I had zero confidence in the power of the gospel to save anybody, but I just prayed a sort of feeble prayer of, Lord, help me to believe. And the Lord did all of that, and he just put me in the right place at the right time, and just kind of handed it there on a platter just to say, Joe, this was never about you. This is never about what you could do or how much you know or your confidence or your eloquence, but this is entirely about my salvation and the fact that I have a heart for the world. I so love the world. And this is what I'm doing, and you just want to get involved in it. And so I said, okay, Lord, I want to be involved in what you're doing, and here we are.
Praise God. Yeah. What a delightful time to get to know you both, and we are delighted, and thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for being here and those watching online. May the Lord bless you and your ministry here with us these few days and in the months and years ahead. God bless you. Thank you for being here.